Alright, hello once again. This is Brandon, and for my final project, I'm going to be presenting on deaf education history and deaf and hard of hearing library services. As I was gathering research for this presentation, my attention was caught between the history of American deaf and hard of hearing culture and education and the current state of access and accommodations. As such, my presentation will be separated into two main sections, starting with the past and concluding with the present and the future. I'll offer a brief history of systems of deaf education in the United States, connect the spread of deaf education to the public in general and to libraries in specific, and provide examples of contemporary deaf and hard of hearing services in libraries. There are countless histories of deaf education in the United States, and many of them predate the establishment of formal schools. But the majority of traditional histories of deaf education begin with the founding of the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. The ASD, established in 1816 as the Connecticut Asylum for the Education and Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons, was the first established school for the deaf in the U.S. There had been prior efforts to establish schools for deaf and hard of hearing children, but we can count the American School for the Deaf as the first formalized one. There were three main figures associated with the founding of this school: Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, Laurent Clerc, and Mason Cogswell. Clerc and Cogswell both had experience with deafness. Clerc was a deaf white man, and Cogswell was a white man with a deaf daughter. In fact, many of the earliest schools for the deaf were founded or operated by deaf educators, a fact that highlights the long-standing involvement of deaf people in the shaping of their own culture. Gannon offers an abridged list of schools founded by deaf persons that I've reproduced on this slide to show the exponential spread of schools for the deaf in the 19th century. Clerc himself is considered an early champion of deaf culture. He was educated at a school for the deaf in France, and through his career at the ASD, promoted the adoption of a standardized system of sign language, a modified French-American Sign Language that eventually evolved into a standard American Sign Language. He also promoted the creation of an exclusive community of, for, and by deaf people, where they would find jobs and communicate in sign language. This utopian gesture hints at ideas of deaf paradise, but we can't look at these idyllic notions without acknowledging disparities in access and opportunity that were present from the inception of deaf formal schooling. For example, the Texas Institute for the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind Colored Youth was established in Austin in 1887. Mirroring the segregation of traditional schools in the state, this school was meant for attendance by only black children. The school itself was not merged with the Texas School for the Deaf, the corresponding school for white children, until 1965, and then not fully integrated until 1966. Nonetheless, schools for the deaf were important sites for the construction of deaf identity. Accounts describe how, quote, 19th century educators watched as deafness was transformed into capital D deafness before their eyes. Access to education and community afforded the emergence of a deaf point of view, and, quote, educated deaf people increasingly grew to view the handicap of deafness as a social construction. More radical activists in their time, such as Clerc himself, advocated for the creation of a separatist deaf state. The first convention of the National Association of the Deaf was held in 1880. The group intended to advocate for the social, educational, and professional advancement of deaf people across the country. By the turn of the 20th century, advocacy turned toward civil rights protection and equal access to such social necessities as personal insurance, the right to drive, labor protections, and participation in the arts. Gallaudet University, the first higher educational institution for the deaf, and the, quote, only bilingual university for deaf, hard of hearing, and other deaf disabled students in the world, was chartered in 1864, and by 1891 was coeducational, instructing men and women together, and training new generations of teachers who might instruct deaf students. Communication and language, particularly written and sign language, form the crux of deaf identity and culture. Libraries are centers for information and communication, and as such, there is important work that must be done to ensure access to this information is equitable for deaf and hard of hearing patrons. Alice Hagemeyer, who graduated from Gallaudet University in 1957, is a deaf librarian who has spent her career working to make libraries more accessible for deaf and hard of hearing patrons. In a 1976 article for American Libraries, she emphasizes that communication is the key struggle for deaf and hard of hearing people who want to use library services. Quote, because of their inability to speak normally, that is, to use spoken English, deaf people do not go to libraries. They do not expect to be understood, and traditional library materials often do not meet their needs. In a 1992 article titled "We Have Come a Long Way," her perspective on these challenges seems to have changed drastically. She notes such technological improvements such as text telephones, computer bulletin board systems, and television closed captioning, as well as social improvements such as sensitivity training for librarians and the increased availability of ASL interpreters. Hagemeyer also mentions the then recent passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, a landmark piece of civil rights law designed to provide discrimination protection for people with disabilities. It aims not just to prevent active discrimination by exclusion, but also to ensure equitable access for people with disabilities. As such, it sets forth requirements for public and private entities to provide reasonable accommodations for people who might have difficulty with a standard good or service. In the case of deaf and hard of hearing people, this might mean offering transcriptions of video or audio content, or hiring a qualified interpreter to sign during an event. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also passed in 1990, is intended to provide those same protections to children with disabilities in academic settings by devising an equitable allocation of resources to provide an equal educational opportunity for all individuals. Schools for the deaf can easily satisfy this law, as can assistive technologies and services in public and private hearing schools and libraries. Regarding accommodations that libraries can provide for deaf and hard of hearing patrons, the transcription or translation of auditory materials held or presented by the library are a primary concern. Many public libraries hold regular programming for children and families, including storytime sessions. A study by Bushman and Fagan highlights the importance of an early literacy instruction at libraries for all children, emphasizing that, quote, libraries can play an important supportive role in early literacy development, not only for deaf and hard of hearing children, but also for their families. Librarians can help to bridge the reading achievement gap for early learners by providing information about early literacy development and programming of materials, including books in American Sign Language, graphic novels, and DVDs with closed captioning. Libraries might provide separate, specialized early literacy programs for deaf and hard of hearing children that focus on vocabulary building rather than rhyming and pronunciation. They might expand their collections to include materials with printed pictorial American Sign Language and captioned videos. They also might form partnerships with other community organizations to connect with deaf community and learn what resources people need. Offering sign language interpretation at any live spoken events will open up those events to deaf and hard of hearing people. A children's story time you're hosting would be more accessible if it's read by somebody using American Sign Language, or if that person is accompanied by an interpreter. A hearing loop technology that captures audio with a microphone and uses a magnetic field to transmit that audio to telecoils in a person's hearing device. They allow people using these devices to hear a presenter or other audio source more clearly. It's a more expensive technology that your library might not currently possess, but it's worth learning to use if it does and petitioning to get one if it doesn't. So my questions for you are, first, throughout this class we have discussed the concept of universal design. What are some ways a library might apply this concept to design a space, program, or collection that is inclusive of deaf and hard of hearing patrons' requirements? Second, if you sign or have friends or family who do, what is your experience with deaf culture? If you don't, what impressions or assumptions do you carry with you that you might re-examine? Third, many deaf and hard of hearing people do not see their lack of hearing as a disability. Rather, they embrace deaf culture and may see family lineages of deafness as a kind of, quote, deaf royalty. How does the cultural heritage of deafness interact with our learnings about the medical and social models of disability, and with non-traditional and traditional narratives of cure? And fourth, have you ever received job training in a library or elsewhere related to deafness or hearing loss? What have you learned, and how often do you put this training into practice? And my activity. For my short lab activity, I want you to first pick a public or grade school library you know or like. Second, visit their site and find 2 programs or services they offer to deaf and hard of hearing patrons. If you're unable to find anything, I encourage you to call the library and ask a staff member what programs or services they offer or have offered. Once you've done that, present your findings in your reply. and then also brainstorm at least one more program or service relevant to the library's mission or service population that the library might benefit from according to their offerings, benefit from adding to their offerings. Right. Then I have my references here, and my image references too. And that's it. Yep, thank you so much.